My name is Joe Forte. I am a digital humanities specialist with Virginia Tech Publishing in the university libraries there. And we're talking about the American Soldier Project, which is a project for which the library and BT Publishing has provided a sort of contextualizing support for the digital humanities aspects of that project and helped with some media production. Today, I'm speaking with members of the advisory board for the American Soldier Project. With me is Beth Bailey from the University of Kansas. Dr. Bailey is a foundation professor, founding director of the Center for Military, War, and Society Studies, and a member of the Department of History at the University of Kansas. Kurt Piehler from Florida State University is also joining us. Dr. Piehler is director of the Institute on World War II and the Human Experience and an associate professor of history at Florida State University. Rounding out the panel, I suppose it is Jeff Pooley from Muhlenberg College. Dr. Pooley is a professor of media and communications at Muhlenberg College. So welcome everyone. I'm glad to the opportunity to speak with you today. I think as members of the advisory board, you bring perhaps a unique perspective to the project, one steeped in an appreciation for the value of the scholarship in the project, but also looking at it in an overarching way, sort of broadly, the logistics of the execution of the project, the value of the crowdsourcing, it's the value of engaging with primary sources like the ones included here. If you would just go around, I guess beginning in the order I introduced you, beginning with Beth, and just say who you are and maybe begin to address your association with the project.
It's wonderful to have a chance to be part of this, and I feel the same way about the chance to be part of the larger American Soldier Project. It's an incredible project, and before I say anything else, I just want to say how amazingly grateful I am as a historian to the people who have done all of this transcription work. It's an incredible effort, and also to those who are leading the project. I write about military, war, and society, and am especially interested in the experiences of those who are serving in the U.S. military, and the opportunity to have access to all of these responses, the qualitative responses, is just unparalleled. And it's going to change the way that we write about World War II.
This has been a fabulous project to be engaged with. I've used the sort of citizen transcribing model, or more accurately, the student transcribing model, way back when I started the Rutgers Oral History Project on World War II. And a few years ago, when I got to the Florida State University, I actually established for a while a crowdsourcing project where students would transcribe documents from our collection. And in fact, Ed took me up on the offer, Ed Gittry took me up in the offer, had two of his classes work with our collections, and we transcribed and we put them in Omeka. And I think that contributed, to Ed's thinking about the American Soldier Project. And I really encouraged him to sort of pursue this project because the Samuel Stouffer volumes are widely used by historians. The American Soldier volumes, there were 4 volumes published by Princeton University Press in 1949. And historians have used them, but have not had access to the raw data, or at least not had easy access to raw data. And several years ago, I was writing a small book, and I was trying to find these. I thought, surely these free responses exist, and I couldn't find it. I had a graduate student go to the National Archives, and she was able to get some of the reports. And she asked for the free responses, but I think the archivist she talked with didn't know where they were, didn't know. And so I think when Ed told me these responses existed on a few reels of microfilm, I really encouraged him to say this is really a gold mine, particularly given the fact these surveys were anonymous, which means I think they are free from a lot of the censorship and self-censorship that a lot of World War II writings have.
You know, and I share Beth and Kurt's enthusiasm for the project. I come at this from the point of view of an historian of social science. And so as Kurt was just mentioning, this 4-volume series, also called The American Soldier, was published in 1949 and widely influential. And for the most part, the way in which it was influential was through not so much the free responses, but instead the quantitative tabular data from surveys. And in some ways, those volumes were the foundation for a more quote unquote rigorous, certainly resolutely quantitative social science that took hold in that period. And so I see this project in a way as a rescue operation to restore some of the human voices that don't get top billing in the 4 volumes and that have been, in Kurt's comment, sort of lost to researchers. And much more than that are now going to be, in the next phase of this project, opened up to the entire public, to not just historians and other scholars, but to students and indeed educated, interested members of the general public. So I share the immense gratitude to the volunteer transcribers and congratulations for the project.
Yeah, I would just sort of add, I mean, one of the reasons I was so excited about this project, because if you read the American Soldier volumes, and yes, they're effort to be rigorous social scientists, but you would have glimmers in those volumes. And then if you get the reports, the unpublished report, you have glimmers of some of the interviews they did and free responses, and you think there's a gold mine here, because just what they publish is just remarkable. And so this is an amazing project, both in terms of the team that created the technology to make this possible, and also, again, the citizen transcribers and the various backgrounds, how important their contribution is to scholarship and the greater understanding of the American GI in World War II.
I remember a long time ago, I was working on a book on World War II, and I used the American Soldier volumes, thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if there were responses to go to instead of these numbers, not knowing that it even existed and not having a way to find out. And in the process of working on that book, we did a lot of oral histories, and everybody told us how wonderful it was during that period, how everybody pulled together, how there was no tension, how they described ahead of the greatest generation. And that was the truth that those people felt in retrospect. But in the process of working on this, we found a set of censorship records, anonymous censorship records from letters that were written during the war, in which people displayed all sorts of anger and frustration and many of the not so pleasant pieces of World War II. And it completely changed the book we wrote, and it made it a much better book. This does that in ways that are almost unimaginable, in the sense not only of getting past the ways in which people rewrite the histories based on who they became later as they do oral histories, but in showing the ways in which the soldiers related to the institution that they were dealing with. It brings back the humanness of this project in a way that is just going to be invaluable.
And I would just add that we don't even know what is in these 65,000 transcripts that have only now just been transcribed. And it will be not just the professional historians who mine this material, but in fact, some of the transcriptionists themselves, I suspect, who will look for patterns, find interesting nuggets of insight, and indeed curate possibly exhibits online that have nothing to do with any scholarly institution.
One of the things I might sort of say something is how important the Samuel Stouffer 4 volumes were to our understanding of World War II, and how widely used and credited even by historians who don't realize where the data comes from. Because the studies, like for example, when you seek to understand why soldiers fight. Now, it is interesting on my own project that I'm currently doing on religion and the American GI, that actually prayer ranks even above comradeship and what sustains soldiers. And that's sort of been an overlooked point. But the idea of the sort of band of brothers of comradeship as sustaining soldiers is right out of the Stouffer volumes. The idea, and an influenced military policy, the idea that soldiers at a certain point will break down mentally if they're in combat too long, influence the military to adopt tours of duty that we wouldn't do like we did in World War II, fight until you either died or wounded or the war ended, because we realized that mentally soldiers couldn't take it. It was very influential both for how we understand race, but also promoting the integration of the military in the 1940s and early 50s. So the Stover volumes are really very significant for policymaking, for historians, for social scientists. And so having access to this raw data, I think will even be more exciting what we learned to both support their conclusions, but also new directions that they didn't go with. And I think particularly for the field of historians and literary scholars, I can definitely say literary scholars looking at everyday writing and everyday expression and drawing upon these.
I think one of the things we're doing right now too is just celebrating the transcriptions that have taken place. And while we're all on the advisory committee and aren't in that group of people who have done so much work in transcribing and have gained so much expertise as they've done it, I used this as a project in a class I was teaching on American War and Society. And it was fascinating working with the students who loved doing it. But it made them really understand what expertise they didn't have. They didn't recognize so many of the references or the abbreviations, and they struggled a great deal to read cursive. But they also compared the different entries they had, and it gave them a much better sense for the diversity of the people who were serving, people who were almost illiterate, whose responses were very creatively spelled and very hard to decipher, and those people who wrote practical volumes and beautiful penmanship. It was an amazingly useful exercise for a class, and I'm in some ways disappointed that the transcription is done, because it was probably the best thing that my students did all semester.
Yeah, I would echo Beth, and I have not transcribed for this volume, but when I was the director of the Rutgers Oral History Archives, I did my share of reviewing transcripts, word for word. And I really have an appreciation for what the transcribers do. I would also echo what Beth said about the sort of variety of experiences. I mean, we definitely, as historians and social scientists, talk about sort of some broad patterns of the impact of World War II, but there's a lot of variety. I mean, there's a real difference between GIs who are on the front lines, those who are not. There's real differences in gender and race and how people experience the World War II. And I think these volumes will be very useful for that.
So yeah, you've spoken a lot about the sort of the value of the sources themselves in helping to allow the history to transcend the mythology of the greatest generation. It's kind of a people's history, the history told by the soldiers themselves and all of the soldiers. And is there some, and a little bit about the value of the project for the folks who are transcribing. So it's not only sort of democratizing the voices that tell the history, but it's democratizing the hands that process those primary sources. Could you say a little bit more about crowdsourcing a body of primary source material like this, and sort of the value of that in the processing itself, the value of it for broader society? Because I mean, a lot of these transcribathons, they work history classes, undergrads or graduate student volunteers, but community members and just the entire crowd of transcribers and Zooniverse just coming to it, drawn by a general interest, really has spread the wealth a good bit.
One of the things I would say, what I've liked about when I've engaged students in first at Rutgers and then at Florida State with sort of doing the real thing, is it allows students in the general public to do the real thing, to do basically primary research and make a contribution. I often told students when they were at Rutgers or when they are interning at the Institute, if you write a paper, you might put it in your file, you might save it. More likely, you might probably toss it in the garbage at some point. This is going to endure. And I think one of the things, and they're making a contribution to scholarship that's going to be influential, I suspect, for at least, conservatively, at least for 100 years. So I think, and I would also say is, when I did the Rutgers Oral History Project, one of the reasons I went to student transcribers, I had them serve as co-interviewers and do transcripts, is I didn't have a budget. And if we had hired paid transcribers, this project would have been, millions of dollars to do it. So we are indebted to more than transcribers, but really, historians, archivist historians who have really made, worked with primary sources. And I think even, and I think Beth has talked about how it's impacted her class and how they think about World War II.
And I would just follow up Kurt's point to say that the cost that this would normally entail would be enough to make it only attractive to some private vendor. And in the typical case of when historical materials like newspapers get archived by private vendors, they then charge quite a lot, and they lock out anyone who isn't affiliated with a university or sometimes even a wealthy university. And so the fact that these transcripts will be open access and reusable for any purpose nearly is a result of the fact that the labor put into the transcribing came from volunteers, from citizen transcribers. That is what made it possible to keep it open to the public.
I would also add, I think it's very much in the spirit of, I would argue, of Franklin Roosevelt and of George Marshall. And they were imperfect leaders, and there's much to criticize, for example, of the adherence to Jim Crow in the Army, the sexism that existed, and so forth. But I think Marshall and Roosevelt really believed this was a people's war, that, he established over the objections of many of his subordinates. He said it's important, these are citizen soldiers, we need to know what they think. And you see in World War II sort of a remarkable effort to take the GI very seriously, in the American Soldier Service. What are they thinking? Why are they acting the way they do? What do they want? And you see that also this sort of focus on what the average soldier thinks and does in the combat interviews done by the Army historians. You can see this effort to create a voice for the GI and how they structure both the Yank magazine, which is an official publication, but still very much aimed at the average GI, and Stars and Stripes, which is run by sergeants and written and privates. And that, I think that is all part of this real effort to sort of promote a vision of American society as an inclusive vision. And while they made a lot of mistakes and it was imperfect, I think how we're even doing this project highlights, we're a mass project, we're using citizen archivists, and we are going to disseminate this widely to the public. It's the people supported the war, and the people are now supporting this project through the NEH grant and through their archiving.
Well, it's been a real pleasure for me to speak with all of you. Dr. Bailey, Dr. Piehler, Dr. Pooley, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.